So, what's the purpose of you learning this particular first part of biology? It's because they want you to appreciate that even when we start looking about more complex things like genetics and carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins, they want us to appreciate that life begins at the cellular level. Okay, and this is very important because diseases such as cancers and all those diseases, they start from where? They start from the cell. It just starts with a mutation in just one cell, and then it's going to spread to what? It's going to spread to the other. The cell will multiply, replicate, and then it's going to spread to the other parts. So then it's very very important that as medical doctors in training that really you have this understanding. So yeah, so biologists, of course, we know biology is the study of life. So biologists pretty much will be studying every aspect of life. So again, that's on the far left, you can see there, you start from the biggest thing, which is biosphere, meaning everything that is alive, okay, that is living, because that's bio, okay. Then sphere, where everything is, right? And then ecosystem. Then we are now narrowing it. Let's say we just talk, okay, we are just going to talk about the oceans, or we are just going to talk about the forests. Okay, so then we are narrowing now from the biosphere. Now we are going to the ecosystem. Then we continue narrowing it to a population. We say, okay, let's only look at fish in the ocean. Okay, then let's now talk about the individual fish. Now that individual fish, let's now talk about um its heart, and that heart, or maybe let's say those intestines for that fish, they've got muscle, they've got tissue in them. Oh, you see, and then those tissue, let's say maybe for instance the stomach, it's going to have the smooth muscle. Now smooth muscle, that's a tissue. So smooth muscle tissue, that tissue has got cells, which are the smooth muscle cells. Then a organelle. Then now start talking about the individual, what? The individual cells. Then the cell is going to have an organelle. An organelle is just pretty much things which are found where? Things which are found in the cell of the mitochondria, and all those things which will make up the cell, right? Then, apart from the organelles, you're going to have macromolecules. You're going to have proteins. You may have carbohydrates there, but there the example used is what is proteins. Then monomers, macromolecules are formed from where? Are formed from monomers. So you break down that protein, you're going to have an amino acid. Then amino acids are what? Are atoms. An example being carbon, nitrogen, in hydrogen, right? And also oxygen. So that's pretty much it. So that's why we study cells, because we understand that the cell is the simplest unit of what? Of living matter. And it's the simplest unit of living matter that can carry out all activities necessary for life. In short, a cell in its own right, it can survive. It doesn't need anyone or anything, right? Like it doesn't rely on anything else for it to be able to what? For it to be able to survive. It's able to do respiration. It's able for it to do replication. So it's able to do all the activities that are going to be able to sustain it, isn't it? So now it's very important, as you've seen with what we had started with, where I was saying amino acids, then they are going to have atoms and everything. It's then becomes important to understand the chemistry of life, atoms, molecules, and reactions that happen in the body, because you have certain illnesses that people are going to have. It's just because a certain reaction is not ongoing, it's not going on in the body the way it should be. The same thing, such as maybe has got someone has got a defect in respiration. And so that defect in respiration, what's going to happen is that the person, maybe it could be there's just one particular enzyme that has got a problem. and respiration is not ongoing, and that person can die. So you see, is to start thinking like that as a medical student. So they have got atoms and elements. So elements found in living organisms. So all parts of the earth are made of 92 natural substances called elements. Okay. Now we know from chemistry that an element is a substance that is made of only one kind of atom. So what this simply means, if we look at something like sodium, sodium only contains what? Sodium atoms. Okay, the moment you add something else to it, let's say when it reacts with chlorine to form sodium chloride, it's no longer an element, isn't it? It becomes a compound, as we will see later on. But one thing that is important is to take note that an element is a substance that's made of only one kind of atom. So when you look at, for instance, carbon, if you only have carbon alone, alone, and alone, then that's an element. The same for mercury and pretty much any other substance that is made up of only one kind of atom in its structure. So whether something is living, is dead, or non-living, they are made up of elements. An example, we are going to have, as human beings, we are going to have carbon. Even if someone dies, carbon is still there, going to be decomposing. Then non-living things, talk about charcoal. Charcoal has got carbon there, right? Yeah, that's why it's able to be bent, and we're able to get certain amount of energy from there. So that's something important. Now, remember we talked about the fact that just earlier on we talked about the fact that there are 92 natural substances called elements, right? And now what happens here is that it's only 21 of those 92 naturally occurring elements that are essential for life, meaning in as much as there may be so many elements, it's not every element that is essential, that is required for life. As a matter of fact, other elements are even injurious to to our health. In short, in other ways, other elements are actually destructive. Are actually destructive to what? Are actually destructive to ourselves. Okay, so okay, now getting back to this, only 21 of the naturally occurring elements are essential for life. Now, of course, they are the common ones. I'm sure by now you may realize that amino acids contain carbon, nitrogen, hydrogen, oxygen. When you talk about carbohydrates, they contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Talk about lipids, they contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So you will realize that carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and hydrogen, they are the most common elements in organisms. However, they are not the only ones, because but they are the most common elements in organisms. And then other elements are going to occur in living organisms in smaller amounts. So you can talk about phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and all those things, all those uh, elements that are mentioned there. So now this table is just giving you an idea of the percentage for which elements make up the human body and why that element is important in the body. So all this is just for you to be able to appreciate when someone says someone has got an illness and they're not able to breathe properly. Why is it that they have to be put on a ventilator? It's because they're not able to breathe properly on their own. The same way, if someone has got COVID and they are struggling to breathe, what do? You put them on a ventilator. What are you trying to achieve? You are trying to ensure that they are getting what? Enough oxygen. You are trying to ensure that they've got sufficient oxygen. So now the first element there, we've got oxygen. So you see the symbol we already know from chemistry, it's O, capital letter O, right? Then the mass, you see it makes up 65%. Uh, yeah, so it's about 65%. Okay, so required for cellular aspiration. Okay, so for respiration, right? And what is respiration? production of energy. So this entails that processes which are happening in the body, burning our sugars to produce energy. You need oxygen. If oxygen is not there, you're going to start having what you call an aerobic respiration. So this is where you are having respiration, but then you are not using oxygen, okay? And that produces lactic acid. That's why you see someone was running and running, then they just faint, okay? Because they were burning sugars at a very fast pace, and their oxygen levels could not cope up. And so they started producing lactic acid, and then that lactic acid increased, and they had what we call lactic acidosis. You learn about it in physiology next year. So they'll have something we call lactic acidosis. When someone faints, yeah. So that's about it. So oxygen is present in most organic compounds, and it is a component of water. Okay. Then carbon, 18%. It forms the backbone of organic molecules. It can form four bonds with other atoms. So now here is the thing. Uh, as we will see when we start talking about carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids, in other most organic molecules, almost all of them, is that carbon is at the center uh, of these. You can talk about DNA, you've got the carbon rings there. You can talk about carbohydrates, like mentioned earlier on, carbon is there. So it then tells us that it's a very, very important element. Then hydrogen, 10% there, and then present in most organic compounds, also present in water. So again, hydrogen are usually common with what? Commonly found together with carbon. That's important to take note of. Then nitrogen. This is a component in all proteins. So we'll look at the general structure of what? The general structure of amino acids later on, and we'll realize that actually in every structure of amino acid that you are going to get, there will always be, okay, there will always be nitrogen in it, right? And also when we start looking at the nucleic acids, but of course, yeah, you also see that nitrogen is what? Nitrogen is present, okay? So that's about it. Then you've got calcium. Now, calcium is very important. I'm sure you may remember that if someone is not having enough calcium, what happens? They are going to have, if it's a child, you've heard of rickets, where the bones are going to be bending and those things. So you're going to have structural defects of the bones and the teeth, because calcium is very important in the formation of the bones and the teeth. And also, you will realize when you start looking at in physiology, when you talk about how muscles contract, how impulses move along nerves, how you are able to sense something. It's because certain impulses are moving along your nerves. But I won't go too deep because you learn that in your physiology. Otherwise, calcium is important. And then also in blood clotting, we all know how important blood clotting is, because at one point we've been injured to a certain degree. So calcium is important in what we call the clotting cascade. You learn that in physiology next year, where you see how important calcium is when the clotting factors are interacting, and how calcium just mediates that. Huh? And then also in cell wall of plant cells. So you know that plant cells are the ones that have got the cell wall. So calcium there is an important component. Then phosphorus. We'll look at the structure of nucleic acids, and you will see that phosphorus is there. That's why we call the bond that happens between the nucleotides. We call them what? We call them phosphodiester bonds, isn't it? So phosphor, you can hear the phosphor there because of phosphorus, but we will dive into that later on. Then potassium. So potassium, this is pretty much, again, it's important in what? In conductivity, in those impulses. okay, neurons firing and all those things. Potassium is important. Then sulfur, there are certain amino acids that contain sulfur. We'll look at them. Okay, then sodium again, this is very, very important in the conduction of what? In the conduction of impulses along your nerves. And then also it's very, very important in terms of electrolytes. So there's what we call electrolytes. So as a human being, you have sodium in your body, you have potassium in your body, you've got all these ions in your body, and sodium is the one important one as well. So that's something to take note of. But in your physiology, you talk about what amount is outside the cell and what amount is inside the cell. But for now, it's not. It shouldn't concern you. Okay, so magnesium, you see that the amount are decreasing. It's now 0.1%. This is important in blood and body tissue, and also this is a very important part of enzymes. These are components where an enzyme needs some part of magnesium perhaps for it to be able to work properly. And when we look at enzymes, you will see that certain enzymes have to interact with certain non-enzymes structures, okay, for the enzymes to be able to work. So we'll be able to look at those things as well. Okay, then also magnesium in plants, let's not forget it, is that magnesium is a component of chlorophyll. Very important there. Then chlorine is very important because it's a principal negative ion of tissue. So remember we said sodium is the principal positive ion of tissue. So because we've got the principal positive and negative, sodium and chlorine. So you can just remember it as salt. You've got sodium chloride, that's sodium and chlorine. And so this helps to balance out, the positive and the negative charge, right? Then you've got iron. Now, iron is very important again. There are certain enzymes which are going to need to interact with iron for them to be able to function. And then also, you may have heard of hemoglobin. We'll talk about it when we start looking at genetic mutations and how sickle cell disease comes about. But for now, just know that iron is a very important component of hemoglobin. Of course, we know hemoglobin is that component of red blood cells that is important in carrying oxygen and carbon dioxide. Let me now talk to iodine. Iodine, this is a component of thyroid hormone. I'm sure you all have heard of the thyroid gland. This thing that you have in between, just midpoint of your neck. So the neck now midpoint, you're going to have the thyroid gland. So it's the one that produces what you call thyroid hormones. And so iodine is a very important. I'm sure you've seen certain salts where usually they'll say iodated salt, because those who are not having enough iodine, those are people who are going to see their neck is swollen, and you say they've got a goiter, isn't it? Okay. So now let's now look at these atoms. So what do we know about atoms? Of course, perhaps you may have already learned in chemistry. So this will just be more or less like a reminder of what really the atom is about. So the atom has got a nucleus which contains the protons and neutrons, and then the nucleus is surrounded by what? Is surrounded by electrons. Electrons are arranged in what we call shells, okay? But as you will see in chemistry, when we look at atomic structure, that really this is a little bit more complex than they are showing it here. Because here, the only thing that I want you to understand is just to have a general idea about the atoms, knowing fully well that it's something that's covered in entirety in your chemistry. So there we see we've got, like I said, we've got the nucleus. You can see that's where the protons are. And we know that the protons are going to be positively charged and the neutrons are neutral. Okay, so it comes from the word neutron. Okay, then electron are what? Are negatively charged. And so what you will find is that the atomic number, the atomic number, that's the number of protons in an atom. So let's look at what we are having there. For instance, we've got sodium there. So sodium has got an atomic number of 11. So what does that tell us? So that tells us that there are 11 protons in the nucleus of a sodium atom. And then one thing we know, that a sodium atom, it's going to be neutral. Okay, if it hasn't lost any electron, it's going to be neutral. So if you've got 11 positive protons, and then so what number of electrons? We know electrons are negative. So what number of electrons should you have for you to have an atom that is neutral? So you need to have the same number of what? You need to have the same number of electrons. So that's why for a neutral atom, what you're going to have is the number of protons is equal to the number of electrons. This is for a what? For a neutral atom. If there is any deviation of some sort, then now you're getting an ion. If there are more protons than electrons, you get a what? You get a positive ion. If you get more electrons than protons, you get what? You get a negative ion. So that's something important to take note about. Then there's now the atomic weight. So the atomic weight, basically you are looking at the how heavy the atom is. Okay, and so we can use that to actually find the number of what? The number of neutrons. So you say atomic weight minus atomic number, then you're going to get your so it's going to be atomic weight minus atomic number. So that's going to be 23 minus 12, isn't it? In the case of sodium. So we're going to have 12 electrons. So really basically that's what those notes are explaining there. And we've dealt with pretty much everything there. So now something that's important is that these same atoms, they can be able to join together with other atoms. And so these can either be atoms of the same element or atoms of different elements. For instance, we can have oxygen and oxygen uh, join together with an oxygen and oxygen atom join together to form what? To form oxygen molecule. And then you can also have oxygen and hydrogen coming together to form what? To form water. So that's something. And then uh, what they'll form is then a what? Is a molecule. Okay, so what will be formed will be what? Will be a molecule. So now let's now look at a number of important atoms, such the ones that we looked about, with that we previously talked about, the ones that really are important, or rather, they are the most common in the living organisms. So then, what you want first to know and realize is that let's look at hydrogen. So you see, hydrogen has got an atomic number of what? Has got an atomic number of 1. So it's got one proton. So if it's got one proton, it means that since it's neutral, okay, it's a neutral atom, so meaning it's going to have one electron as well. Then we want to now say we want to find the number of neutrons. So we are going to say what's the atomic weight of hydrogen? It's 1. So if we say atomic weight minus atomic number, you see it's 1 minus 1, it's 0. So you see that hydrogen, of course, we know when we'll look at it later on, that hydrogen actually has got 3 types. There's hydrogen 1, hydrogen 2, and hydrogen 3. And these are what we call isotopes, but we'll look at that later on. But I just want you to keep in mind that the difference in isotopes is the number of neutrons, because the number of protons is the same, it's the number of neutrons that differs. And if the number of neutrons differs, then their atomic weights are going to what? are going to differ as well. So that's why isotopes have got the same proton number or the same atomic number but different mass numbers or atomic weights. Okay. Now, when you look at hydrogen, uh, we know from bonding. So bonding, this is basically where an atom and an atom come together to form a what? A molecule. So now that interaction that's going to cause that molecule to be formed. That's going to be what? That's going to be bonding. So there are principles which we call there are certain rules. So there's the octet rule where you say an atom is going to be satisfied when it's surrounded by what? When it's surrounded by 8 electrons. But what we see for hydrogen and helium, there are exceptions because for these ones, they are satisfied when they are surrounded by 2 electrons because that's only what they can satisfy. So what this means is that a hydrogen atom can um, it can share that electron that it has with another molecule such as oxygen to form water. And you'll see in chemistry when we talk about covalent bonding, you'll be able to see, and we'll look at it even here just later on. But I just want you to have a good idea of where we'll be heading to because there's a point there that's talking about chemical bonding. So that's why I wanted to bring it. So meaning for this hydrogen atom to be balanced, it needs one more electron. Okay, so well, which can either gain from or share with another atom in chemical bonding. Huh? Then for carbon, it's the same thing. But again, look at carbon, you see that outside or the outer shell. Okay, so remember we said the electrons are going to be in shells. Okay, so carbon has got 6 electrons, isn't it? So remember the first shell can only accommodate 2 electrons. So that's why we are putting those 2 electrons. Then we see that the next shell it only has how many? 4 electrons. And we are putting them like that, where we've got one down, one on top, and then the other two on both on opposite sides, because we want to reduce the repulsions, okay? We want to reduce the repulsions between these electrons, because the closer they are, the more unstable our molecule is going to be. So that's an important point to take note of. Okay, then so now the outer shell. Remember, we said that apart from hydrogen and oxygen, the other atoms are satisfied when they are surrounded by how many? 8 electrons. So when you look at carbon, you see that carbon can either gain or share how many electrons? 4 electrons. Because remember, already it has 4, so it means that it needs 4 more for it to have that 8, which we call the octet rule. Okay, but it's discussed in more detail in your chemistry. Then nitrogen. So for nitrogen, we see that what we are going to have is that the outer shell has got 5 electrons. Okay, has got 5 electrons. So how many more does it need for it to be fully satisfied? It needs 3 more so that it can be 5 times, so it can be 5 plus 3 electrons. Then you're going to have 8 electrons. Then it's going to be satisfied and balanced. So meaning a nitrogen atom is going to need or require 3 more electrons, which may be gained or shared. Then for oxygen, the outer shell has got 6, so it needs how many for it to be satisfied? It needs 2 more. So that's really about it. So yeah, so really basically that's what we've talked about here. Everything that they are saying is what we've already talked about. We even talked about an isotope where I said an isotope, this is going to be elements which have the same atomic number but different what? Different atomic weights. And the different atomic weights it's coming because they've got different numbers of neutrons. So that's an important point to take note of. So now we are trying now to zero in on what? To zero in on oxygen as an example, so that everything that we really talked about, we can really have an understanding. So, like I said, here in biology, they're just trying to introduce you at the chemical aspect. But of course, these are things which are dealt more in your chemistry. But they're just introducing you so that you can be able to appreciate that as medical students, chemistry is equally important uh, to your profession, okay, as medical doctors later on in life. So let's zero in on oxygen and see how everything that we've talked about so far we can be able to incorporate uh, into what we've discussed. So oxygen has got an atomic number of what? Of 8. So what does that tell us? It means that it's got how many? 8 protons and it's got 8 electrons. Okay? That's if it's neutral, okay? Yeah, then now it's got an atomic weight of what? Of 16. So what's the number of neutrons? You say number of neutrons is equals to atomic weight minus atomic number. Okay, so it's going to be 16 minus 8, so you're going to get your 8 there. So then what this basically means is that you see that shape that we are having there. What's going to happen is that uh, you can see there is that nucleus thing which has got an 8p and an 8n. So that's just simply saying 8 protons and 8 neutrons. Now the electrons have to be circulating around the nucleus, and so these are going to be arranged in what? In the shells, okay, or in the first orbit of the shells. So what you are going to have is the first shell can only accommodate how many? 2 electrons. So that's why you see that when we're drawing our structures, we give the first shell, we give it how many? 2 electrons. So then the other ones go to where? To the second shell. Now, the second shell can accommodate as many as 8 electrons. But so, for the case of oxygen, we see that the first shell is going to have 2, then we have a remainder of what? Of 6 electrons. But 6 electrons are less than 8, so meaning all of them can be accommodated in the second shell with having space for 2 more. So that's why it can be able to share 2 more electrons, and be able to take part in chemical bonding. So that's something that is important to take note of. So in the second case of oxygen, one of the 4 orbitals of the second shell is not occupied by a pair of electrons. So what they are basically saying is, let me show you from here. So you see, they are saying that, okay, first let's look at, so there they are saying that the second shell has got what? 4 orbitals, isn't it? So has got 4 orbitals. We know that an orbital can only accommodate how many electrons? 2 electrons. Okay, so you see the first shell has got only what? 1 orbital, so it can only accommodate 2 electrons. Then the second shell has got how many orbitals? 4, meaning it can accommodate how many electrons? 8. So you see, you've got here this one orbit occupied by a pair of electrons, this one here occupied, this one occupied, but there is one orbital which is empty. So that's basically what that point there is trying to illustrate. So then you may be wondering to say, what's the difference then between an orbital and the shell? So the shell is an energy level around the nucleus that may contain one or more orbitals. So simply put, uh, the orbitals are going to be where? In the shells. Okay, so the first shell is called the K shell and contains one spherical orbital, and that's why the first K shell is only able to accommodate how many electrons? Two electrons. Because remember, an orbital can only accommodate an orbital can only accommodate two electrons. Okay. Then the second shell, like we've said, it's going to contain four orbitals. And since each of these orbitals can only hold up to two electrons, so this means that the second shell can only hold what? Can only hold up to eight electrons. Okay, so that's an important point to take note of. So, okay, so that's something that's very, very important to take note of. Then we now talk about the second shell. Okay. So the second shell is called the N. I think that's an error there. It should be the L shell. It should be the L shell because it moves like K, L, M. Okay, so it moves alphabetically starting from K. K being the first shell. So that was an error in writing. So then the third shell, then this is called the M shell. So you see, B, C, D, F, H, I, J, K. K, the first shell. L, the second. M, the third shell, right? So that's how it should go, and not the way it was. Okay. So that's something that I wanted to take note of. So then that's really, really something that's very, very important to take note of. And so the third shell is also called the M shell. It may contain 4 to 9 orbitals. So meaning that if it contains 8 orbitals, meaning that 9 orbitals, meaning that it's what? Meaning that it can accommodate how many electrons? A maximum of 18 electrons. Because remember, each orbital is going to have two electrons. So 2 times 9 orbitals. So you're going to have what? 18 electrons in the 9 orbitals. So that's about it. So meaning that the third shell can accommodate up to 18 electrons. Okay, but I'm sure you will realize when we start drawing, and when you start drawing these things in chemistry, that usually when the third shell usually reaches 8, usually we tend to go to the other one because it's really quite tricky to be able to draw all 18 like that, right? But that's something that will be covered in chemistry. But for biology, no, the third shell can accommodate a maximum of 18, and it's the same thing in chemistry. I'm just saying that when you are writing it, but don't worry, to be discussed in chemistry. So pretty much the things which we've talked about is that the protons and neutrons form the nucleus of the what? Of the atom. We've talked about it. Then electrons will be what? Will be moving about around, or will be moving around the what? Around the nucleus of the atom. And then what we are going to have, the first electron shell can hold a maximum of 2 electrons, the second can hold a maximum of 8, and the third can hold 8 electrons. Then now we talk about isotope. So this is already something that has been introduced. So, but there's no harm in repeating. So isotopes. So isotopes, these are atoms of the same element that have the same atomic number but different mass numbers, or they've got the same proton numbers but different mass numbers, or they've got the same proton numbers but different numbers of neutrons. Okay, so those are all different ways you can what? You can explain, but to make life easy, isotopes are atoms of the same element which have got the same atomic number but different mass numbers. So we know that the mass number, that's the same as the atomic weight. Okay, so we know that to get atomic weight, we say we add number of protons and number of neutrons. So hydrogen has got what? 3 isotopes. So now what happens with these 3 isotopes is that we've got ordinary hydrogen, there is deuterium and tritium. So what happens here is that for the ordinary hydrogen, that's the okay. Let me do this so that we don't mistake the two. So the one that is showing, the only thing showing on the screen, that's hydrogen one. Yeah, so that's hydrogen one, or we call it ordinary hydrogen. So you see there, it's got a mass of one and an atomic number of one. So meaning if we say number of protons is equals to mass number minus atomic number, what does that give us? When we do the calculation, we get number of neutrons being what? Being zero. So meaning the hydrogen atom, that the ordinary hydrogen or hydrogen one isotope doesn't have any neutrons. Then we now got the second one, which is deuterium. So for deuterium, what happens is this is also called hydrogen 2. So you see there the mass number has increased. This is because this one is the hydrogen that has got one neutron. So remember, one proton plus one neutron, you get two. So that's your mass number two. So that's deuterium. Huh? Okay. Then tritium. So if yeah, so tritium. So for the hydrogen one, you see that its occurrence is one in 5,000 atoms. Yeah, then for the tritium, occurrence is one in 1 million atoms. So you see it's very rare. So tritium, you see there, it's also called hydrogen 3, or commonly called tritium, of course. And this one, the mass number you see there, it's three. So meaning number of neutrons, we know it's mass number minus atomic number. So what you're doing there is you're saying three minus one. So you see there two neutrons. So that's basically that. Another example would want to use is also for carbon. So you may be aware that there is what we call carbon 12, carbon 13, and carbon 14. So carbon 12, this is the carbon that has got 6 protons and 6 neutrons. Then the carbon 13 is the one that has got 6 protons and 7 neutrons. Carbon 14 is the one that has got 6 protons and 8 neutrons. Okay, so those are isotopes, and so there are quite a number of isotopes. And that's where in chemistry, that's where you have to calculate your percentage abundance, but in biology you are not expected to calculate that because it's done in chemistry. So now, use of isotopes, I'm sure you may remember from your grade 12 that you used to talk in history, no, let me to grade 9, in his grade 8 rather, where we used to talk about radiocarbon dating 14, and how they were using it to find how old broken human was, to find how old Zinjanthropus was. So that was radioisotope. What? Radioisotope carbon 14, or radioactive uh, carbon 14. Okay. So the other uses, of course, they're used for cancer treatment because radiation from radioisotopes can interfere with the cell division of the cancer cells. Because usually cancer develops because the cells have undergone a mutation, and so they are not yielding to the normal cell cycle. Don't worry, we will talk about the cell cycle. But yeah, so because of a mutation that has happened, the cancer cells are, even when there's normal cells, they'll go through the cell cycle, they'll have mitosis, and then it will stop. It happens in a controlled manner. But for cancer, it doesn't occur in a controlled manner. So when you use the isotopes and you use the radiation, I'm sure you've heard of cancer treatment called radiotherapy, where someone is having radiation to try to kill the cancer cells by trying to interfere with their cell division. So if they don't divide, then they die. Huh? Then, of course, I've talked about radiocarbon dating 14. Then isotopes, there is cobalt 60, which is also used in the treatment of cancer. So you see, so weak beams of gamma rays can cure cancer because it kills cancer cells more easily than healthy cells. So, but of course, there may be side effects here and there, but overall, what you will see is that the healthy cells are not going to be killed at the same pace as the cancer cells are being destroyed, but there's always a risk of the health cells being affected as well. So now, yeah, so now going deeper now into the molecules and compounds and to see the different kinds of bonding that occurs with regards to these atoms and everything. So in nature, most atoms do not exist alone. Instead, they combine to form molecules, isn't it? So a molecule is a substance composed of two or more atoms. So sometimes two atoms of the same element combine together. So, but yeah, so this is something that we talked about earlier on, where we can have oxygen and oxygen combine to form oxygen molecule. Okay, we can have a hydrogen atom and a hydrogen atom combine to form a hydrogen molecule. And then sometimes you may have different atoms, okay, or we can say atoms of different elements where they can combine together and to form molecules such as, let's say, hydrogen and what? Hydrogen and water. Sorry, hydrogen atom and oxygen atom. When they combine, they are going to form what? Water, isn't it? So now what you are going to get there, you're going to get molecules. And remember, a molecule, we've already talked about about the definition. Okay, so that's something to take note of. Then a molecule that is composed of different elements is called a compound. Okay, it's called a compound. So the best way you can remember this is when you are staying in your yard alone, you don't call that a compound, right? But when you've got a place where people, there are many houses in one place, someone is renting there, someone is a tenant, and you call that Pajapa compound, or that compound, isn't it? So that's the key thing, right? So that's how you could remember that a molecule that is composed of different elements is called a compound. So when two atoms of hydrogen combine, a molecule of hydrogen is formed. We've already talked about that. Okay, and also we've also talked about water. Now, water is formed when two atoms of hydrogen combine with one atom of water. Why is that it takes two atoms of hydrogen? Remember, the formula for water is what? H2O, isn't it? So meaning one molecule of water has got two atoms of hydrogen and one atom of oxygen. So a molecule of water is the smallest unit of what? Of the compound water. Meaning if you wanted to divide water, you get a cup of water and you start to divide the smallest unit that you are going to get of that water is going to be a molecule of water. Because once you divide the molecule of water, once you divide the molecule of water, what's going to happen? What's going to happen is that it's no longer water. Okay? You are now going to have what? Just hydrogen and oxygen. And now, so you've seen they're just showing us so hydrogen forming what? Molecular hydrogen. And I'm sure you've seen how they've drawn them, but don't worry, you understand that when we start talking about bonding, which we this is just introductory. So now, of course, the characteristics of compounds are almost always going to be different from the elements that comprise them. For instance, let's look at copper. Sorry, let's look at sodium chloride. Sodium chloride, this is the salt that we see, right? That we use. But when you look at the way it looks quite unique, but it's actually formed from sodium, which is a silvery metal. Okay? And it's interesting because it actually explodes when it comes in contact with water. Okay? But and then you've got also chlorine, which is a deadly yellow gas, which was actually used in the World War I to kill soldiers. But interestingly, when sodium and chlorine come together, you are going to have sodium chloride, which we're able to eat, to use in food without really having any difficulties or having any illnesses. So that just shows, the elements which have formed that compound they are showing us characteristics which are very, very different from the elements. Okay, so the compound is having very different characteristics as compared to the elements that are forming it. Okay, then now there is energy that is within the atom. Okay, and so what happens is that atoms all atoms possess energy, because here is the thing: you've got negatively charged electrons which are circulating around a positively charged nucleus. So, if there wasn't any attraction for the electrons, they would have wandered away from the nucleus, right? But because there is that attraction between the negative electrons and the positively charged nucleus, there is that attraction, isn't it? There is that attraction. Now, it's very interesting to take note that even though the attraction is there, the electrons are not pulled into the nucleus. So, what does that mean? It means that originally, like I've said earlier on, the electrons want to go away from the nucleus, and then the nucleus will use the attractive forces to ensure that the electrons, they don't move too far away from the nucleus. But again, the electrons cannot be moved into the into the nucleus, because they are also having a certain repulsion, because they want to go on their own. Okay, so that's the thing. An example is this: if you are trying to pull your friend is going the opposite direction, and you're trying to pull them, you know, even though you are using energy to pull them, you may not move them to your direction. At the end of the day, they can just remain where they were. But if the person is not trying to move away from you and you are pulling them, you are going to pull them up to close to you. So that's the analogy there. So seeing that it's time for the next session, then we'll end here. So are there any questions with regards to what has been done?